hundreds of millions in market cap disappear overnight, okay, following these sanctions. It doesn't matter if you're investing $5,000 or $5 million. You got to know the region you're investing in. You got to know the players involved, the politicians, and you got to know that there's heightened risk.
All right, welcome back. Today's a pretty important topic for our podcast, especially for mining investors and commodity-related investors. We're going to get into the latest sanctions imposed by the U.S. government on specific officials in the Nicaraguan government targeting the gold sector in that country. This podcast, I think, will be quite enlightening because Alex has experience in Nicaragua, specifically visiting gold assets, exploration projects, and mines. And so just to highlight really briefly, and we'll include a link in the description, I'll just read direct from the Treasury's website, the U.S. Treasury. So in relation to the sanctions, the Directorate of Mines has managed most mining operations in Nicaragua on behalf of the Nicaraguan government. As such, the Directorate of Mines, or the DGM, is an important piece of state-controlled gold operations in Nicaragua. Ortega, the country's leader, and his cronies, this is from the Treasury's website, continue to use proceeds derived from the production and sale of gold to line their own pockets and to pay off those who keep the regime in power. The regime has used this power to intimidate and jail those that speak out about the regime's corruption and to sow instability around the world, including by supporting Russia's further invasion of Ukraine. By designating DGM, Treasury aims to cut off the Ortega-Murillo regime from its ability to use gold proceeds to oppress the Nicaraguan people. That's directly from the Treasury's website.
Look, this begins a long time ago, and it's actually an unbelievable story. You know, this happens a lot. It doesn't just happen in Nicaragua. It happens to other countries, and people just, you wake up one day and read the news, and this happens. But there's always a history. There's always two sides to the coin. Let's listen to this story here. So the Spanish first arrived in the early 1500s, and the colonizers are attracted for the gold. The same thing that Biden is targeting 500 years later, basically, right? So 1821, Nicaragua declares independence from Spain. By the 1850s, the country is descending into chaos. One of the liberal parties running there puts out "Help Us" to North Americans. And an adventurer, a lawyer by the name of William Walker, he's a mercenary, heads down there with a gang of Americans, and they help squash all resistance. The liberals think he's going to, hand over the power now. He helped us. He's going to go home. No, he makes himself president, of Nicaragua, rules for a year. This is like the peak of manifest destiny, right? Americans truly believe, in the middle 1800s, late 1800s, that they're going to just take over everything. So anyways, after about a year and a half, they finally get this guy out of there. They, publicly execute him. That could have been where American involvement ended, but it's really where it begins. Now, 1909, the U.S. lands Marines to bolster rebels, hoping to out the current administration. Now they're successful. The U.S. military takes over Nicaragua, and they rule a military state from 1912 to 1933. They create a National Guard, which is basically like a hybrid between a police and a military that is running the country. They were doing this in other countries in South America. It was known as the Banana Wars. So the U.S. military occupies the country for about 21 years. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Opposing forces start rising up, and they're led by a man named Augusto Sandino. Now, he ousts the Marines, 1933, 1934. Pressure on them, gets rid of them. But the National Guard is still around. They still have a lot of power, a lot of control. Santino gets the Marines out, but the National Guard gets a president in. Okay.
And the National Guard, just to clarify, that's U.S. controlled, supported. What is it?
Yeah, so the National Guard is made up largely of Nicaraguans, but supported and created by the U.S. military.
Right.
Okay, so these were guys working hand in hand with the U.S. military for 20-odd years, so strongly aligned with the U.S. Now, they get a man by the name of Anastasio Somoza Garcia in as president in 1936. Now, his family rules Nicaragua for 43 years, from 1936 to 1979. The Nicaraguans offered troops for the Korean War, the Vietnam War, World War II. Anything they put forward, they just towed the line with the U.S. all the way. Now, during this rule, the 43 years, the Sandinista Liberation Front, or the FSLN begin to rise up. These guys are named after Sandino, okay, the original guy who ousted the Marines, right? Now, these are left-wing Marxists, and they basically start waging a guerrilla war against the Somozas. Now, during this time, they're receiving funds from the Soviet Union, Fidel Castro. This is where the Russia connection starts to come in. Now, this is also where Daniel Ortega comes into play. He's a young guy. He's going to school as a lawyer. He becomes totally swept up in the rise of the FNLS. He joins them, okay? He joins the Sandinistas. Now, while he's in his 20s, like, this guy's in his late 70s now.
Running the country.
Yeah, he's been the president now for 15, 20 years, but we're going back to the 60s here, the 70s. Now, this guy's in his early 20s. He robs a Bank of America to fund his cause, okay, the Sandinistas. He robs a Bank of America in downtown Managua, guns blazing, makes out with the cash to raise funds for his political cause. He did this.
So in his eyes, I'm stealing from the Americans to fund my uprising.
Basically, yeah. The Somozas catch him. Now they get him. He's arrested. He's thrown in jail and tortured for 7 years. The whole time he's in jail getting tortured by, the U.S.-backed Somozas, the Sandinistas are getting stronger. They're getting more widespread. The common man's starting to know about them. They're getting more powerful. They're starting to rise up. They're kidnapping people. Okay, they're kidnapping family members of the Somozas. They're doing all kinds of stuff. They negotiate his release in 1974 for some prisoners that they had kidnapped. But there's just one caveat. He gets sent to Cuba. He cozied up with Castro and he learned extensive guerrilla warfare tactics, okay, while in Cuba. And he also formed a lifelong bond with Fidel Castro. So the Somozas are still in power. 1972 comes along. There's a massive earthquake, destroys all parts of the countries. They get huge donations, come in, and like we've seen over and over in history again, those donations don't get to the people who need them the most. The government uses it to line their pockets even more. Now the Sandinistas are really rising up. They're really gaining power. Americans withdrew their support, okay, in the mid-70s, and this opened the door. And basically what happened was there was a televised murder of an American journalist down there in the mid to late 70s. And that caused Jimmy Carter, to basically withdraw all support for Nicaragua and the Somozas, okay, who had been clinging to that for grants and other things. Okay, so now it's a free-for-all. So now, by 1979, it's all over. The last, reigning Somoza, flees to Miami. He resigns. He's out of there, right? All his whole family members, all his close associates have to move abroad, change their names. Nobody knows what happened to them. Anastasio Somoza was the last one standing, right? So he flees to Miami. He's denied asylum by President Carter. Okay, he's got nowhere else to turn to. Now he goes to Paraguay, takes his family. He's living in Paraguay, living that quiet life, hiding out there behind his walls in some villa, when he's ambushed and murdered by a 7-strong Sandinista commando team using Russian machine guns to shoot up his entire place. The statement they released when they got him in 1980 was, "We cannot tolerate the existence of millionaire playboys while thousands of Latin Americans are dying of hunger. We are perfectly willing to give up our lives for this cause." The FSLN, Sandinista Liberation Front, takes over the country. Now, there's a transition for about 4 or 5 years that Daniel Ortega is leading, and he's at the heart of. They immediately close in their ties with Cuba and the Soviet Union during this time. And 1981, Reagan begins supporting resistance to Sandinista's rule. Okay, so he's funding the Contras, which are a rebel army, basically guys from the old guard, right? Guys from the National Guard who are now have become guerrilla warfares. They're on the other side now. They're in the jungle fighting these guys. So that goes on for a few years, but basically they never seriously challenged the Sandinistas after that point, okay? So there's a junta of national reconstruction from 1979 to 1985, of which Daniel Ortega is leading, and then he's elected president of Nicaragua in 1985. Okay, and he takes control in 86. He rules for 4 years. Now, during his 4-year period, in 1987, inflation hit 14,000% annual inflation. Okay, so there's a ton of printing of money going on. He's got U.S. embargoes to deal with. Nicaragua is descending into chaos. And by 1990, the average guy on the street basically has less money in his pocket than he did in 1970 under the Somoza regime. So all this work, going to jail, being tortured, getting sent to Cuba, coming back, overthrowing the Somozas, reconstructing the government, taking power for 4 years. And it basically is a complete disaster and blows up in Ortega's face. Now, it's 1990. They go to the election polls. He's voted out. He's out. He's done. So he tries again in 95. He loses. He tries again in 2001. He loses. Finally, in 2006, Ortega is reelected as president of Nicaragua. He's been in power ever since. The longer he stays in power, the tighter his grip on control gets. Everyone now who's in any even remote, position of power in the country is loyal to him, basically, and him alone. Now, let's fast forward to 2019, my trip down there. I'd heard of Ortega, and I knew he had, I knew he was a Marxist and it had some kind of relations with Fidel Castro, but I also knew that there were some very well-respected, huge companies working down there and doing quite well. But, I did a bit of research and I talked to some guys down there, and, the 2018, when you talk about sort of what Ortega is capable of, there was a huge protest in Managua, the capital city of Nicaragua, and it started due to a forest fire in their rainforest that was out of control, that, he wasn't accepting help. They weren't really doing anything about it. The forests were burning. College students came out on the street. There was protests everywhere. Now, during that period, within about the same week, he had floated the idea to cut pension payouts by 5% and other social security reforms that were going to lessen what he had to pay and increase what he was bringing in. Now, this is, when everybody took to the streets and it was kind of pandemonium. So, what he did was the military's opened fire on a crowd in a stadium, and over 300 people were killed, many of them young students and even some kids. So it was just a horrific tragedy. That's when Ortega really lost the street. He lost, the support of the vast majority of Nicaraguans, and is basically been ruling in fear ever since.
Great historical breakdown of Nicaragua. With a lot of mines, particularly precious metal mines and even more specifically gold mines, they're becoming harder and harder to find. Barrick's CEO just came out recently and said it's hard to find good deals, good gold mining deals that they want to put their money into right now. Good gold assets are tough to come by. And so mining companies are going abroad to find attractive assets. In many instances, they're going abroad into developing or third world countries. And obviously, if you're investing in commodities or metals opportunities and mines and exploration assets, there's a ton of risk to begin with. But when you go into these third world and developing nations to develop mines, and you're investing in the companies that are going after these seemingly attractive assets, they come with an even heightened level of risk because of the political factors and the history behind these countries. They're more volatile, and not to overlook Canada or the US's political issues and societal issues with natural resource development, but there's a lot of risk involved when you go into these emerging economies and developing nations and third world countries. Nicaragua is a small country, but serves as a great example of the heightened risk in some of these regions of the world that a lot of gold miners are being forced to go into because good assets are becoming harder and harder to find.
Yeah, it's very fluid. It can change in an instant. Whenever you're in a place where the relationships are so important, in a place like Nicaragua, they can decide whether or not you're in business. And whenever that's the case, you got to really, really move carefully.
You take Fruta del Norte, for example, in Ecuador. Back in the day, looked like a fantastic asset. Kinross was developing it rather quickly. I can't remember how much they put into it, a few $100 million. And all of a sudden, the tax regime around that asset changed once the government saw, holy cow, this is a fantastic asset with tons of upside, and it's becoming very real. The money started to become very real for these governments, so they changed the terms. And that's a huge risk when you go abroad. But there's also the added risk now, especially with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, that Western governments will come in and say, no. You can't do business in that country anymore because for whatever reason, whether it's support of Russia, dictatorial regimes doing questionable stuff to their own populace, whatever it may be. There's added risk now more so than probably in the last 10, 20 years of our own Western government saying, get out of that country.
Yeah, it's fractionalized. As this conflict escalates and potentially spreads to other parts of the world, you're going to see people taking sides, and particularly with natural resources, right? As we head into the winter, everyone is getting a very firm reminder of how important it is to be in control of your own natural resources.
History repeats, these strategies replay, and so that's why we deem this Nicaragua topic so important for the pod today, is because it applies to A, mining investors, which most of our audience is, and we are as well, and B, geopolitics and how it can influence your portfolio and add or decrease the level of risk in the type of particularly commodity investments that you make.
Yeah, you have to know the context going in and at least the recent history. And when I say recent, I mean like 50 years. You've got to know where things stand.
All right, that about wraps it up. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the pod. Until next time, take care.
Thanks for tuning in.